I'm a 32-year-old nurse, married to Daniel, who's 34 and works as an accountant. After 7 years of apartment living and saving every spare dollar, we finally bought our first home, a small 2-story place just outside the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We spent the first night surrounded by half-open boxes and takeout containers, laughing about how we didn't even own a proper dining table yet. For the first time, it felt like we could make decisions without anyone's opinion hanging over us. That feeling lasted about 48 hours. Before we'd even unpack the dishes, Daniel's mother called. Patricia is 62, sharp-tongued, and proud of the fact that her traditional values made Daniel who he is. She didn't ask if she could come see the new place. She announced that she'd stop by to inspect it and give some seasoned advice. Daniel hesitated, but saying no to her always meant days of guilt-ridden silence, so he agreed. The next morning, Patricia arrived carrying a notepad and a critical stare. She walked through the living room like an appraiser, tapping her finger on the mantel and muttering about modern clutter. The curtains were too dark, the sofa oddly placed, and apparently our color palette lacked warmth. She adjusted picture frames, opened cabinets, and even reorganized our spice rack mid-conversation, calling it helping us build good habits early. That night we made dinner, something simple, and she used it as an opportunity for a lecture. While Daniel and I ate, she listed the rules she'd lived by when raising him. No shoes inside, chores before television, and dinner exactly at 6 every evening. She said structure was what made a home civilized. Daniel smiled weakly and focused on his plate. I noticed how he barely spoke when she was around, as if years of practice had taught him that silence kept the peace. Her visits became routine after that. She'd drop by every few days with excuses, to fold laundry, to wipe a counter, or to check if we needed help arranging our pantry. She'd open the refrigerator, frown at my choice of yogurt, and comment that I must be busy if I didn't have time to keep things organized. It reached a point where I couldn't leave a drawer closed without wondering if she'd open it the next day. One afternoon, I came home to find her rearranging our kitchen shelves again. I told her gently that I preferred things a certain way and asked her to stop. She looked at me as if I'd just spoken another language. When Daniel got home, he tried to calm things down, saying she just means well, which somehow made it worse. That night, instead of arguing, I printed a small sign and hung it by the front door. It read, "House rules, call before visiting, respect our space, no rearranging items." The next time Patricia came over, she spotted it instantly. Her face went red. She accused me of humiliating her in her son's own home, and stormed out, muttering that I was treating her like a child. A few days later, at a family dinner, she made a pointed comment about younger women not understanding respect for their elders, while staring straight at me. On the drive home, Daniel finally admitted he was tired of the constant tension, but asked me not to make him choose sides. I didn't answer. I just looked out the window, already forming an idea. If Patricia believed her rules made a home civilized, maybe it was time she experienced what living by them actually felt like. 2 weeks after that dinner, Patricia called out of nowhere. She said her house's plumbing had burst and that she'd need to stay for a week. Her tone wasn't a request. It was the kind that expected an immediate yes. Daniel didn't even pause before agreeing. "She's family," he said, already checking which room she could use. I didn't argue. If anything, it felt like the perfect setup for what I'd quietly planned since that night in the car. Patricia arrived the next morning with 2 large suitcases, a toolbox, a stack of cleaning gloves, and her own pantry labels. She moved through the house like a home inspector, opening cupboards and mumbling about improving efficiency. Within hours, she'd changed the thermostat, replaced my detergent with hers, and left notes on the counter about proper folding technique. Daniel kept glancing at me, waiting for me to lose patience, but I just smiled. That evening, as I was cleaning the kitchen, I remembered something Daniel once mentioned. His mother used to have a house rule book when he was a kid. She'd written down every rule from bedtime to chores, laminated it and taped it to the fridge. Daniel laughed when he told the story, but that night I decided it was time to bring it back. The next day, I called Daniel's sister Laura to ask if she remembered it. She didn't just remember, she still had a copy. Within minutes, she sent me photos of every page. "Please tell me you're not about to do what I think you're about to do," she said between laughs. I thanked her and started typing. I printed Patricia's rules word for word and hung them on the fridge under the title Patricia's Proven Household Rules. Every single one, from chores before leisure to dinner ends at 6 sharp. Even no unnecessary electricity use past sunset. I made sure it looked neat, laminated, and official. That evening while setting the table, I brought it up as casually as I could. I told Patricia we thought it'd be fun to follow her old rules while she was staying with us. Since they worked so well when you raised Daniel, we figured we could all live by them for the week. She looked from the paper to me, lips pressed tight, unsure whether to feel honored or insulted. Daniel tried to focus on his food. The next morning, I started early. At 6 a.m., I knocked on her guest room door with a bright, cheerful voice. "Rise and shine. Morning chores start early. Remember your rule. The day begins with discipline." She opened the door, hair in curlers, completely bewildered. By breakfast, she was muttering about coffee being too bitter, but I just reminded her of her own words. Breakfast first, complaints later. She blinked like she wasn't sure if I was serious. Later that afternoon, Patricia tried to snack before dinner. I quietly took the plate and reminded her, kitchen closes after 6. She looked stunned but said nothing. That evening, when she left her dishes in the sink, I stood beside her with a smile and said, "You always said dishes should be washed right away. Wouldn't want to break your own rule." Daniel nearly choked, trying not to laugh. The next few days became a rhythm. Patricia tried to bend her own rules, but I enforced every one, gently, politely, word for word. She tried to leave the lights on after sunset. I reminded her of her energy-saving rule. She tried to stay up late watching TV. I pointed to the bedtime by 10 section. Every correction was served with perfect courtesy, the kind she always claimed to value. By midweek, the house had gone silent. Patricia still followed the schedule, but moved slower now, like someone realizing the weight of their own habits. One afternoon, she tried to vent to Daniel about how these rules were meant for children, but he just said, "They were your rules, Mom." She didn't respond. That night, she skipped dessert and went to bed early. When I checked the kitchen later, the counters were spotless, and her laundry was folded neatly. On the fridge, the list still hung perfectly in place, and next to it, she had taped a small sticky note that simply read, "Consistency builds character." By the end of the week, Patricia was quiet, almost thoughtful. She packed her things without comment, double-checked that she'd left the guest room tidy, and placed her old laminated list on the counter. "These rules were for kids," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. I smiled and thanked her for following them so well. Daniel drove her home that afternoon, and when he came back, he stood in the doorway, half amused and half stunned. "I think you broke her," he said. I shook my head. "No," I told him. "I think she finally saw what living by her own standards really feels like." For the first time since we'd moved in, the house felt completely still. No rearranged cabinets, no surprise visits, no judgment lingering in the air, just silence, finally earned through structure. Patricia herself had written, and for once she couldn't argue with it. A few days after Patricia went home, Daniel and I finally had a weekend to ourselves. We cleaned, cooked dinner together, and enjoyed the silence that had been missing for weeks. But by midweek, the peace started cracking. Patricia began calling Daniel again, this time to clarify that her rules weren't meant to be followed. So literally, she said they were guidelines, not strict laws. Daniel didn't say much, just raised an eyebrow at me. I told him we'd still respect her system exactly as written. That Friday, she came over unannounced just to check on things. I greeted her with a polite smile, motioned toward the printed Patricia's proven household rules still hanging on the fridge, and told her we were keeping up with them perfectly. Her expression froze. It was clear she'd expected me to drop it after her departure. That evening, she stayed for dinner. I told her we'd eat at 6 sharp, like her list said. But she took her time setting the table, and didn't sit down until nearly 7. Without a word, I poured myself a bowl of cereal and started eating. Daniel followed my lead. Patricia's fork hovered midair. She asked if we were skipping her dinner, and I just pointed to the clock and smiled. Kitchen closes at 6. The next morning, the tension shifted. She refused to help with the laundry, saying it wasn't her chore day. I reminded her that according to her own rules, everyone contributes equally. She rolled her eyes but eventually folded a load of towels. Not well, but folded. The following day, she tried a different tactic. While Daniel was at work, Patricia invited one of her friends over without calling first. I met the woman at the door, offered her coffee, and kept the entire visit on the porch. When Patricia asked why we weren't going inside, I simply said, "We ask visitors to call first." The woman gave a sympathetic smile, clearly understanding what was happening. That night, Patricia tried one more act of rebellion. She turned the thermostat down several degrees before bed, muttering about how a cool house builds character. I just added an extra blanket to her room and reminded her that we save energy here. Your rule, remember? 2 days later, I was tidying the guest room when I found crumbs under her pillow. I didn't make a scene. I just changed the sheets and left a note on her nightstand. No food outside the dining area. House Rule 9. Later that afternoon, her friend called while I was nearby. Patricia whispered into the phone that she was under strict house rules and couldn't talk long. The irony didn't miss me. That weekend, Daniel's sister stopped by. She spotted the rule sheet and burst out laughing. "She's living her own childhood again," she joked. Patricia glared at her, but didn't deny it. Something began to shift after that. Patricia still grumbled, but started cleaning without reminders. She stopped touching the thermostat. The lights stayed off after sunset. For the first time, she asked before moving anything in the kitchen. At dinner one night, she commented that my enforcement was a bit strict. I smiled and said that respect starts with example. Daniel, without hesitation, looked at his mother and said, "These are your rules. Mom, you always said structure matters." She didn't answer. The house went quiet that evening. Patricia ate dinner alone in the guest room, and when I passed by later, the door was closed but the light was still on. It stayed that way for a long time. The next morning, she came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. For the first time since her arrival, she knocked. I looked up from the stove, and she smiled slightly before thanking me for breakfast. By the weekend, she announced she'd be leaving soon to give us our space. Her tone was calm, almost reflective. I told her we'd be happy to drive her home. She nodded and said that wouldn't be necessary. She'd already arranged a ride. When she left, I noticed she'd taken the printed list from the fridge. In its place, she'd left a folded note that simply read, "You run a disciplined home. I see where Daniel gets it from." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the first sign that she finally understood what she'd been putting us through. As the door closed behind her, the quiet that filled the house wasn't tense this time, it was earned. Patricia moved back to her own house just like she said she would. She called it needing her space again, though everyone could tell it was pride talking. She left quietly, with the same stiffness she carried whenever she felt outmatched. For the first time in months, the house was completely ours again. The silence that followed felt like real peace. No rearranged shelves, no commentary on our habits, no tension simmering in every corner. Weeks passed smoothly. Daniel and I started hosting small dinners with friends, cooking new recipes, and catching up on rest. It felt like we'd reclaimed our home. But peace with Patricia never lasted long. The first cracks showed up through Daniel's sister, Laura. She mentioned during a call that Patricia had been explaining her side to relatives, saying I'd twisted her household traditions and made her look foolish. According to Patricia, she had only been helping and I'd turned her rules into a power game. She never said these things directly to me, always through others. A week later, I ran into one of Patricia's friends at the grocery store. The woman smiled politely but added, almost in passing, that Patricia had been hurt by how she was treated, and that a mother should be respected in her son's home. I just nodded, finished shopping, and left without comment. Daniel heard about it too. He didn't defend her words, but it clearly bothered him. He said he hated the whispers and wished she'd just drop it. I told him to let it be. Her stories would wear thin eventually. Instead of engaging, I focused on something small but symbolic. We'd had a few old furniture pieces Patricia once called cheap-looking. I donated them to a local family who had just moved into their first apartment. When Daniel told his mom about it later, she didn't say anything, but word must have spread. A few days later, Patricia called to invite us to dinner at her place. Her tone was polite but tight, the kind that sounds more like a challenge than an invitation. When we arrived, her house looked exactly like it had years ago, spotless, symmetrical, and cold. The dining table was set with her old lace cloth, crystal bowls, and formal napkin rings. She had even placed name cards at each seat, labeling where Daniel and I were to sit. Just like old times, she said as we took our spots. Dinner began smoothly. She asked about work, complimented the meal, and acted as though the past few months hadn't happened. But halfway through, old habits crept in. Daniel reached for seconds before everyone had finished, and Patricia immediately stopped mid-sentence to correct him.
You know the rule,
she said sharply. No one takes more until everyone's done. Daniel froze. I looked at her calmly and said, I thought those rules were retired. You said adults don't need them. The silence that followed was heavy. For a moment, Patricia's eyes darted between us. She tried to recover by changing the subject, but Daniel spoke up. His tone was steady. Mom, we're adults now. We live differently. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the perfectly set table like she was trying to find something to hold on to. The rest of dinner was quiet. When we got up to leave, she thanked us quickly but avoided meeting my eyes. On the drive home, Daniel laughed under his breath and said, That's the first dinner I didn't feel like a kid. I just nodded. Later that night, I imagined Patricia sitting in that same dining room, surrounded by her perfect dishes and spotless counters, realizing how empty it all must have felt without control to fill the air. The next morning, Daniel showed me a text from her. It only said, Thank you for coming. I'm thinking about a few things. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time she'd ever admitted, even indirectly, that she might need to. A few weeks after that dinner, Patricia started acting different. It began with small, almost awkward gestures, text messages about the weather, a recipe she'd found, or a picture of her garden. They were short and polite, nothing like her usual controlling tone. I replied kindly each time, keeping my answers simple. Experience had taught me that her attempts at change often came with hidden strings attached. Then Daniel's sister, Laura, invited the whole family to her birthday dinner. She promised it would be relaxed, no speeches, no tension. Patricia confirmed she'd come and even said she wanted it to be a drama-free evening. I didn't fully believe her, but I agreed to go. The night started off surprisingly pleasant. Laura's living room buzzed with laughter, kids running around, music in the background. Patricia arrived in a calm mood, greeting everyone warmly, even complimenting Laura's new curtains. She stayed quiet during small talk and seemed to be making an effort to blend in. Daniel leaned over once and whispered that she was actually behaving. It didn't last long. Midway through dessert, one of Laura's kids accidentally dropped a slice of chocolate cake onto the carpet. Patricia's reaction was instant. She stood up, ready to scold, her finger already pointing. Then her eyes met mine. I didn't say anything, just looked at her. Something in her shifted. She took a deep breath, forced a small smile, and said, Accidents happen. The room, which had frozen for a second, instantly relaxed. Laura looked shocked, then grateful. Later, when we were cleaning up, she quietly told me she'd never seen her mother stop herself mid-lecture before. I just shrugged and helped wipe up the frosting. The next morning, Daniel got a call. Patricia had slipped on her kitchen floor and bruised her leg. Her voice sounded shaky but insistent that she was fine. We drove over anyway. She tried to brush it off, saying she didn't need help, but she was clearly in pain. As a nurse, I couldn't ignore it. I checked her leg, wrapped it properly, and made sure she could walk safely. She sat on the couch with an ice pack, uncharacteristically quiet. Then she muttered that she hated feeling useless. I told her she wasn't useless, she just wasn't in charge right now. For once, she didn't argue. The next few days, I stopped by after work to bring her food and make sure the bruise wasn't getting worse. She never asked, but she didn't resist either. Instead of instructing me on how to do things, she started asking gentle questions about my work shifts, about Daniel's job, even about the new curtains in our living room. When she cooked, she'd ask for my opinion on seasoning instead of telling me how it should taste. One afternoon, while I was tidying up her kitchen, she told me about her younger days, how she ran her house when Daniel and Laura were little, how proud she'd been that everything was always perfect. She said it almost wistfully, like she was realizing what that perfection had cost. By the end of the week, her leg had improved. On my last visit before she started walking on her own again, she followed me to the door. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. You run your house beautifully, Jessica, she said. Maybe I was too harsh before. I didn't say anything, just smiled and thanked her. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was the closest she'd ever come to one, and this time there was no pride in her tone, only honesty. A few weeks after Patricia's injury healed, things between us settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. There were polite messages here and there, photos of her garden, short updates about the library where she'd started volunteering, or reminders about upcoming birthdays. No drama, no overstepping. So one Friday morning, I decided to take a small risk. I called and invited her for Sunday lunch at our house. I wanted to see if our new piece could hold on familiar ground. She arrived right on time. For the first time ever, she knocked and waited. When I opened the door, she held out a small bouquet of flowers instead of her usual cleaning gloves or containers of food. It was a simple gesture, but it said more than words could. I noticed her glance toward the house rules frame that still hung by the entryway. She smiled faintly and said, "Fair enough," before stepping inside. We started cooking together. It was strange but easy. She didn't rearrange the spice rack or question how I chopped vegetables. Instead, she asked where things were, waited for directions, and listened. I showed her where the pans were, and she nodded, moving carefully, as if she didn't want to disturb the balance of the room. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching with quiet amusement. Lunch was calm, something I never thought I'd say about a meal that included Patricia. The table was set simply, the air light, and the conversation steady. Daniel looked around midway through the meal and said it might be the most peaceful lunch we'd ever had. Even the silence between sentences felt natural instead of tense. Halfway through, my phone rang. I excused myself for a minute to take it in the hallway. When I came back, Patricia had refilled everyone's glasses and tidied the counter, but she hadn't touched a single thing out of place. It was small, but I noticed. After lunch, we started clearing dishes together. She began to correct how I was loading the dishwasher, but caught herself mid-sentence, taking a breath before quietly changing the subject. I didn't mention it, but the pause spoke volumes. Once everything was cleaned up, we sat in the living room with coffee and talked about everyday things. Daniel's recent promotion, my new work schedule, and the reading group Patricia had joined at the library. She seemed genuinely happy talking about it, no bragging or comparisons, just simple conversation. Before long, the talk drifted toward the house. Patricia looked around slowly and said the place looked warm and comfortable. "It feels like a home where people live, not where they're managed," she said. It caught me off guard. A compliment so direct from her felt rare. I thanked her and told her it took time to make it feel that way. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Patricia said something I never expected. She admitted she'd spent most of her life mistaking control for love. She said she thought being strict meant protecting her family, but it only made people afraid to relax around her. I told her it's hard to change what the world keeps rewarding, being the one who fixes, corrects, and directs. She nodded, and for the first time, the understanding between us didn't need to be explained. Daniel broke the moment with a laugh, saying it was the first time he'd seen both of us look calm in the same room. Patricia smiled at him and agreed that peace felt better than being right. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged Daniel, then me. After the door closed, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under the house rules frame by the entryway. It was folded neatly. In her handwriting it said, "Thank you for teaching me without breaking me." I didn't frame it or show it to Daniel right away. I just slipped it inside one of my cookbooks on the shelf, the one we'd used that afternoon. The house was still and quiet again, but not in the way it used to be. The tension that once lived in every corner was gone. This time, peace didn't come from proving a point or enforcing a rule. It came from both of us, finally learning what respect actually looked like, something that no sign on the wall could ever teach on its own. By early winter, months had passed without a single tense moment. Daniel and I had settled into our usual routine. Quiet mornings, steady workdays, peaceful evenings. Then one afternoon, Patricia called. Her voice was warm, almost uncertain, as she invited us to an early holiday dinner. There was no hint of expectation, no guilt in her tone. She just wanted us to come. I agreed. This time I didn't sense tension, just curiosity about what kind of dinner she would host now. When we arrived, the change was obvious before we even stepped inside. Her house, once spotless to the point of discomfort, felt lived in. A soft holiday playlist played in the background. The lights were gentle instead of blinding, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon instead of disinfectant. There were no assigned seats, no rigidly folded napkins. Patricia greeted us with hugs and led us into the kitchen, where she was still stirring sauce, something she'd never allow before guests arrived. She wasn't hosting alone either. A neighbor and her teenage daughter were already seated at the table, chatting comfortably. Patricia explained that she'd invited them because she wanted a relaxed evening. She didn't once give an instruction or correct anyone. During dinner, the neighbor's daughter accidentally spilled her drink, and for a second, everyone froze. Everyone except Patricia. She laughed softly, grabbed a towel, and helped clean it up, saying it was no big deal. I caught Daniel's glance from across the table. Neither of us had ever seen her handle a mess with laughter instead of panic. Dinner was simple and warm. Roasted chicken, vegetables, and one of my recipes. When the neighbor complimented the food, Patricia smiled and said, "Jessica taught me this one." It's simple but comforting. It was the first time she'd given me open credit for anything domestic. After dessert, Patricia didn't rush to clear the table or correct anyone's manners. She asked about my night shifts and Daniel's promotion, listening more than talking. She mentioned that she'd been learning to enjoy quiet moments. That silence didn't mean something was wrong. Once the guests left, Patricia poured tea for the three of us. The room was calm, no tension, no unfinished business hanging in the air. She looked around her living room and said, "It feels good not having to be perfect." I told her it felt good not having to defend myself. Daniel just smiled. Then her phone rang. It was her cousin, asking if she could host the extended family Christmas gathering like she used to. Patricia hesitated, then politely declined. "I think it's time someone else takes charge this year," she said, and hung up. That small sentence said more than any apology could. Before we left, she asked me to come see her winter garden. The flowers were gone, but the soil was neatly turned, ready for spring. She looked at the bare plants and said, "I used to think control made things grow. Turns out patience does more." We stood under the porch light for a while without speaking. There were no apologies, no speeches, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had changed. On the drive home, Daniel said he never thought he'd see her change like that. I told him she just needed someone to hold up the mirror long enough. A few weeks later, Laura called, laughing that their mother had told her to let the kids handle their own chores. It sounded like a joke, but we both knew it wasn't. Right before Christmas, Patricia stopped by unannounced, but she knocked before entering. She held a small box of cookies and a thin notebook labeled New House Rules. Inside were 3 short lines. Knock first. Ask before helping. Respect goes both ways. After she left, I placed the notebook on the coffee table. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of tension. It was peace, earned and steady. The war that started over house rules had ended in something stronger, mutual respect that finally felt real.